Okay, sorry, picking up from where I left off. So I had just finished walking you through these LD50 numbers. So I just want to stress again, microgram per kilogram LD50s means very, very toxic. This means this is a very potent toxin. It takes a very tiny amount to cause death, okay? Accidental poisonings are typically by eating seeds, so you would be like thinking about these LD50s, it would be on the higher end of the 1 to 10 for humans. Poisonings that are on purpose, right? And the focus here is like, would be warfare or terrorism. Usually that would be by injection. So I believe in the 1978 attempt, like there was an altered umbrella, and so somebody was literally like kind of darted by an umbrella that contained ricin. And that would be how most bad actors would probably try to get it into their targets. But another option might be inhalation or poisoning food. So why have we not seen large-scale attacks or more attacks using ricin? If it's such a potent poison, if it's so easy to get castor beans, you know, and they're cheap and abundant in many different parts of the world, they're not that hard to grow really anywhere, then why don't we see more attacks, right? More poisons. Why isn't this more common, right? And the answer is it is actually, turns out, is hard to get and keep in a pure form, okay? So extracting the ricin from castor beans, while it's not that hard to make castor oil, it is hard to extract pure intact ricin from castor beans. You need to have some level of chemistry proficiency and some equipment in order to get high quantities of pure ricin. And not everybody has access to that or that knowledge. Stabilization is an issue. So because this protein is heat labile, it is knocked out by heat, it is also sensitive to light and to moisture. So you have to store it like at cooler temperatures, extremely dry, out of the heat, in order to keep it in its potent form, and that can be difficult in many settings. The delivery is challenging. So how do you get enough ricin to a large group of people? Like, in order to make this a weapon that would affect more people all at one time, it would require aerosolization, or putting the ricin into the air where people are inhaling it. And it turns out that aerosolization is somewhat tricky from an engineering perspective and requires specialized equipment that not everybody has. There's also detection. So because ricin is on the select agent list, and because it's being used before successfully to assassinate people, we're pretty much on to this, right? So law agencies are on the lookout. We have very good detection methods for ricin, and this is how like the ricin in the White House mail was spotted, and therefore nobody was harmed. So you're kind of fairly likely to get caught, really. This is because we are good at detecting this. We have the forensics in place. All right, let's move on to a microbial toxin. So ricin was a plant toxin, and botulinum toxin, or Botox, more on that in another lesson, is a microbial toxin, specifically a bacterial toxin. So I should have italicized this. That drives me nuts. Okay, so Clostridium botulinum is a common soil bacterium. It's everywhere, and it's a very interesting creature. It makes what are called very tough endospores. These are super tough seed-like structures, and the spores are everywhere in the soil. Okay, the classic example of where you might get exposed to the toxin produced by this organism is eating improperly canned food, right? So this organism's out there in the soil. It can get on the surfaces of plants and like vegetables from your garden. And then if people can them, and if they don't do the canning correctly, so they don't have enough heat, enough pressure, and enough time, then the Clostridium botulinum's endospores, which are heat resistant, will not be killed. And those endospores will actually germinate and grow, forming the actual regular bacterium inside the canned goods. And that bacterium will produce this really potent toxin called botulinum toxin. It's a neurotoxin. It affects the nervous system, and it's a protein toxin. And these are two pictures from different angles of botulinum toxin. Okay, and this causes the illness that we call botulism. It's a food poisoning event. So this is a pretty significant public health concern, like worth mentioning, all on its own, not even focusing on bioterrorism. So I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. So one of the big concerns is canning. So improperly canned foods, which you can spot by, you can't always spot it, but you might spot by seeing like swelling, in the can, which shows gas production, which shows microbial growth, right? So if you consume improperly canned foods, then you might take in the toxin and it will give you botulism disease, which can be deadly, by the way, or at least lead to many, many months in the hospital, right? So I'll talk about the mechanism in a minute, but it's a neurotoxin. It causes something called flaccid paralysis. And one of the consequences of that is you cannot breathe, right? So you can die from that. Very, very dangerous illness. You could also get botulism from a wound, right? So a wound infection, you might, like if you're out, and doing something and you get soil deep into a cut and it grows, the Clostridium botulinum grows and it produces the toxin, you could get infected and you could get poisoned from the botulinum toxin. And then here's a special concern, and that is like if anybody gives unpasteurized honey, right? Unpasteurized honey should never, ever, ever be given to infants, right? So you really should never give it to anybody under the age of 2. And the unpasteurized honey should be labeled there. Do not give raw honey to infants, because raw honey will contain the endospores of Clostridium botulinum. And in an adult GI tract, the adult GI tract will suppress the growth of Clostridium botulinum and we'll be fine. But in an infant, their gastrointestinal tracts are different. They're not yet fully matured. And so they have a gastrointestinal tract that allows Clostridium botulinum to multiply, and it will produce botulinum toxin, and those babies will get extremely sick. So it's like unbelievably dangerous to give raw honey to infants. Never ever do it. Tell everybody you know, okay? One of the things about botulinum toxin is that if you know that you're being exposed to it, or you could be, there is an antitoxin, and it can help if it's given soon enough. Unlike ricin, there is an antitoxin. So it is a nervous system toxin. And you should recognize this because in an earlier lesson, I talked about sarin, and it is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. And so I mentioned acetylcholine in that lecture or lesson. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. Okay, so this is one neuron, and then this is another neuron, and this is the synaptic junction or cleft, this space in between. And in order to have a nervous system impulse, what's called an action potential has to travel down this neuron, and it's an electrical impulse. And then that electrical impulse will trigger a chemical release of neurotransmitters, and they're shown as these little dots here in the junction. And the neurotransmitters will diffuse or float across that junction. Remember, this is a liquid environment in cells and organisms, and they will bind to the receptors on the opposite neurons, the postsynaptic neurons cell surface. And then when those chemicals bind, that will tell this neuron to keep firing that electrical impulse that we call a nervous system response, right? And so our nervous system relies on the transmission of essentially electricity and chemicals. And the chemicals that are transmitted are called neurotransmitters. Some of them are the specific neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, okay? And acetylcholine is degraded by acetylcholinesterase and removed from the neural junction. And we talked about that in the sarin lecture. But now focusing on botulinum toxin, in the case of botulinum toxin, what happens is it blocks the release of acetylcholine. So if you've got botulinum toxin around, it will prevent this neuron from releasing its neurotransmitter, and then that neurotransmitter won't make it over here to this neuron, and so you will see the blocking of a nervous system impulse. So the nervous system is suppressed or inhibited. And that will mean what's called flaccid paralysis. So we won't see muscle contraction. And if you can't do muscle contraction, you can't work your diaphragm and you can't breathe, right? Extremely, extremely dangerous, leads to respiratory failure. So you should be noticing something as you learn about poisons, and that is that whenever we're talking about nervous systems or neurotoxins, we're often talking about neurotransmitters of some type. Opioids, for example, affect neurotransmitters. So if you have too much neurotransmitter, that's not good. Then you have nervous system overstimulation, and that was the mechanism of action for sarin, right? Sarin inhibits the enzyme that removes acetylcholine. It doesn't get removed, so there's too much of it, so you have too much nervous system activity. That's bad, right? That can definitely kill you or harm you. Similarly, if you have too little neurotransmitter, which would be the case with botulinum toxin, then you don't get a nervous system impulse, and that's also not good and can harm and ultimately kill you. So the nervous system, like all the systems of the body, must be in a condition called homeostasis or regulation in order for health, to have health. Okay, so botulinum toxin has been it's been attempted to use it as an agent in terrorism. Most famously, there was a religious cult in Japan from the 1980s into 1995 when the leaders were caught and the cult was shut down. The cult was called Om Shinrikyo. The cult leader, his name was Shoko Asahara. He's pictured here. He went by other names as well. And for many years, it was discovered that they had been trying to produce and aerosolize botulinum toxin, but they were unsuccessful in doing that. There were no confirmed casualties. It was considered a failed terrorist attempt. They switched to using sarin, which they were able to use successfully to harm people in a Tokyo subway attack in 1995, and that triggered the investigation where this cult was shut down. So they were very dangerous people that harmed a lot of others. So let's do a little comparison of LD50s, okay? So I used ChatGPT to sort of pull this together. That's why the formatting's a little funky, but I wanted to do a comparison of a couple of things we talked about and a couple of things that you just know about and a couple that I will mention, okay? So botulinum toxin is the most potent known toxin that humans know about at this point in time, and it's biological, right? I think it's a great example that you can bring up to friends that sort of like to suggest that anything made in nature is good for you or fine. Like, no, a lot of toxins that nature produces are pretty terrible, and this is definitely one of them. Tetanus toxin is made by the organism called Clostridium tetani. It is not an agent. It's not an agent we could use for bioterrorism for a few reasons, but it's also pretty deadly. Sarin is a nerve agent, not a biological agent, but I did teach you about that, so I'm putting it on the slide so you can see that it's deadly, but much less deadly than botulinum toxin. So we're at 1 nanogram per kilogram of an LD50 estimated for humans if given IV for botulinum toxin. Nanogram. A nanogram is 1/billionth of a gram, okay? Sarin toxin is 50 micrograms per kilogram. Micro means millionths, right? So we're 1,000-fold different between botulinum toxin and sarin toxin. It takes 1,000 times roughly more sarin to get to get an LD50 relative to botulinum toxin. Saxitoxin is a microgram per kilogram amount as well. It's a marine toxin, so it is in what is called red tide. Very deadly, causes what's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. Humans get that, so do animals that are exposed to marine waters where saxitoxin is present. Never go where there's a red tide. It's very dangerous. Ricin, 1 to 10 micrograms per kilogram, right? So when we go from nanogram to microgram, that's 1,000 difference. And then ethanol, which people consume for recreational purposes, but is also a toxin, right? It takes about 7,000 milligrams per kilogram orally to kill somebody, right? So it's definitely possible, but it takes a lot more, right? So we're going from nanograms all the way up to milligrams. So this is 1 billion-fold difference. To visualize that, Note that this scale is in logarithmics, right? 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the 0, 10 to the 1, 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3, right? So each gap here, it's 10 times greater, right? And so ethanol is much less toxic, still toxic, but much less toxic. Botulinum toxin, the most toxic of all, right? Botulinum toxin, saxitoxin, and ricin are all on those select agent lists. Sarin is on a list of concern for chemical weapons. Okay, so why don't we see more attacks with both chemical and biological warfare agents if they are so toxic? Again, it is technically challenging, especially the delivery. From an engineering perspective, it is hard to aerosolize weapons of attack, right? But we still worry about the water supply, and I didn't really touch on that here. Other challenges include scaling quantities, purity, and stability of the various toxins. All right, I'm going to close with that.